Well, thank you, Sylvie. I could say as many nice things about her as well. She's done an amazing job here and has been such a massive support and has really helped me in my journey with textile collections care, and so I really deeply appreciate it. So, let's get started. This is 1,000 Words, the Language of Fashion in Gresham's Historical Photography. It's a part of our lecture series, as we already discussed. So upcoming is the podcast launch, and then we also have one in July on Zim's 12-Mile Store. As she already let you know, I am the Volunteer Collections Textile Manager here, or opposite of that, Textile Collections Manager. I'm also the Collections Manager at the Textile Hive in downtown Portland. If you haven't heard of us, please come check us out. It's pretty awesome. I'm also a dress historian. My major areas of expertise are the medieval period in both Europe and the Middle East, as well as late 19th and early 20th century Western women's wear, but also menswear as well, just a little bit more focused on women's wear. This is the outline of the whole talk. We don't need to talk about it too much because we'll go over all of this, but I'm really excited to share with you all of these different topics on clothing and on photography, and let's get going. We need to start first with a land acknowledgement. The Portland metro area rests on unceded land that was home to traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, creating both permanent communities and seasonal encampments. Due to the strategic and systematic efforts to annihilate indigenous peoples from these lands and history, there are many other tribes and nations who traditionally lived, hunted, and fished in what is now Gresham that are not collectively remembered. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. So, why do we talk about clothing? Why is clothing history important? Well, in my view, we are wrapped in clothing from the moment we are born. We are carefully clothed when we are laid to rest by our family members. And in between these bookends of our lives, we celebrate our achievements by wearing special clothing. We use clothing to comfort ourselves in times of hardship. We use clothing to help people understand who we are and to shape their views of us. And we also use clothing to shape our views of others, whether these are accurate or not. In this way, I believe the study of clothing is the study of our collective humanity and of our human history. And that's why it's so important to consider this area of history, which has so often been overlooked. I would say partly due to it being connected to women's interests and history. We're going to be looking specifically at clothing in photographs today, and I think the first thing that's important to understand is that we cannot take these photos at face value. So this first question, were photos edited, comes with a resounding yes. From the very moment that photography was invented, so was photo editing. This treatise on the art of retouching, it's a very long title, comes from 1898. This comes from the Getty Research Institute. You can see here that in the contents, there are all sorts of different things that they edited, including all of the details of the face and the body, hair, clothing, and much more than this. This was to fit the aesthetic standards of the day, and it was quite common, especially in the late 19th and then especially into the early 20th century. We're going to start by looking at a couple of photos that were edited that are in our own collection. This is Lena Elkington. This photo comes from 1912, and you can see when you zoom in really closely that her eyebrows and eyelashes on this eye have all been drawn in. This is a really simple form of photo editing. They didn't do a particularly good job of matching color on this one, so I don't know if this was a particularly professional photo editing job, but this is one way that editing took place. A lot more professional piece of photo editing here. I hope you can see the detail in this photograph. When you look at the photo total, it's actually quite small. This is only about 2 by 5 inches, this picture. When you zoom in very closely, you can see on her face there's all of this scratching that is through her skin, especially around the nose, the eyes, up onto the forehead. This scratching is nowhere else on this photograph. Not on her neck, not on her arms, her hands, her clothes, the background, nothing. This is a form of smoothing that they did. This could be done to cover up any number of what was perceived as imperfections. Based on the age of this person, I believe that this was to cover up acne, which I think is somewhat personal for many of us. But this could also be done to cover up freckles, moles, scars, pockmarks, or even to fill out cheeks, because the ideal was to have very full, round cheeks and not hollowed cheeks like we edit into our photos today. Photos were also edited with regards to clothing. So waistlines were reduced. Anytime you see a photograph where you think, oh God, how could she breathe? She must have removed ribs. It's almost definitely edited. And they also took out things like wrinkles and all sorts of other little bits and bobs. So it's important to understand that when you're looking at historic photography, it is not an exact replica of reality, and it's not an exact representation of how these people may have really looked in life. On top of photo editing, these photos were very deliberately staged. Photographing was something that took quite a lot of time and a lot of supplies, and so it was something that you did very intentionally, especially studio photography, which is most of the photography from the late 19th century. We start to see a little bit more of street photography in the 20th century, and we'll take a look at that as well. One of the major ways that people would intentionally stage their photographs, obviously, is through their clothing, and many people chose to present the very best versions of themselves. Of course they did, right? So displaying status is a huge part of photography in this period. Wealth is very visible in clothing and accessories. And of course, the context of that changes over time. It may not be easy to see what wealth looks like in another time period. I'd like to talk a little bit about this woman's accessories. This is Kate Shattuck. She was married to Henry Clay Shattuck, who together were the first of this name to move into Gresham. One of her descendants, Lewis Shattuck, actually became the first mayor of this city when it was incorporated in 1905. So this was a really important family, and based on that context, we know that she was a fairly wealthy person. One thing that would indicate that are all of her accessories here. She's got this fabulous brooch, these quite large bauble earrings. This photo's from 1865. But what I'd like to focus on here is her hair comb. These were very fashionable at this time and were fashionable through quite a lot of the 19th century. This particular one, I would assume, based off of what we already know about her, is made out of tortoiseshell. At this time in the 1860s, tortoiseshell was becoming a lot more rare and more expensive because it was tortoises were being overhunted, in part to make combs and other accessories. So at the same time in the 1860s is when early plastics are invented, and accessories like these combs were one of the main uses of those early celluloid and cellulose plastics. One of the downsides to celluloid is that it's incredibly unstable and, in fact, so flammable as to be explosive. If you've seen any old film catch on fire, you will know it's the same material. So it's a little bit concerning to put that on your head, especially if you're leaning over candles to do all sorts of different activities. From this photograph alone, we would have no way to know whether or not this is a celluloid or a tortoiseshell comb, right? And in person, of course, you would have been able to differentiate that, and people would have been able to understand those differences in wealth symbols in these combs. But from just a photograph from this distance, it's really difficult to do so. Another way that people showed their wealth, other than accessories, is through embellishment. This woman is named Mrs. Burke. Unfortunately, we do not know her first name. She was married to W.R. Burke, who was an early jeweler in Gresham. And so what we see is this really time-intensive and really labor-intensive beading on this dress. While this photo is marked as being from 1924, personally, I would put this a little bit closer to the 19-teens. That's what this particular silhouette is fashionable in. Now, of course, in rural communities, it is a little bit more difficult to date photographs on clothing alone, because most people were not keeping up with fashion quite as avidly as they were in major cities. But with this woman being quite wealthy, we would assume that she would want to be photographed in the latest fashions, and so we can assume that this may have been taken around the 19-teens. This is a really fashionable silhouette for especially like what's called the Titanic period, so around 1912 to 1914. Also, her hairstyle is very of that period, so. You'll also notice that she has very carefully placed her arm in the center of the photograph to show off this piece of jewelry, which may be a nod back to her husband's work. This fabulous photograph shows quite a few different women sitting outside, also a staged photo, but not inside of a photo studio, which is a little bit interesting. And one of the reasons I think it's interesting that they are outside is how clearly they've chosen to wear these incredibly bright white outfits. These lawn dresses were very, very fashionable in the early 1900s, around 1900 to 19-teens or so. And the color white in clothing is really laden with a lot of social meaning. White is an incredibly difficult color to achieve. A pure white requires a lot of bleaching. It requires a bluing process to counteract yellows. And so having something that's really pure white is a status symbol on its own, but also keeping it white is an incredible task. If you're going outside and sitting on logs, you assume that either you don't care if it gets stained and you can just buy a new one, or more likely you have the resources to get it laundered more regularly. Laundry is expensive, it's labor intensive, and so having white linens and really white clothing has been a symbol of wealth and of class as far back as the medieval period. In fact, there are treatises on having white linens that also connect it to morality, not so much in the virginity and purity aspect, but more in the cleanliness is next to godliness aspect. So having white linens was both class and morality. This one's a little bit more self-explanatory. I think we all can understand the status symbol that fur represents. Furs, of course, are expensive. They're also linked to the colonization of the Pacific Northwest. And so this is a really interesting look into this part of our history. I will point out, we will come back to Mabel. We've got quite a few photos of her, and I think she's quite interesting. Alongside showing off your clothing, often photographs were staged with people's personal assets. While this is not the most luxurious of homes here in Gresham, this farmhouse implies that this family owned land and cared for their land, and they're all standing outside in what is presumably their best clothes in order to have their photo taken. Farther into the 20th century, into the 1920s, it became really popular to have your photo taken with your car. I'm only going to show you 2 images, but there are quite a lot in our collection of people with their cars, or someone else's car. We can't be sure of that either. Here we have Lucy Davidson. She is wearing her furs, of course. She's got her pearls on. But as cars become more popular, they become less of an expensive novelty and more of a symbol of prosperity and modernity. And so the combination of her very modern outfit, she's got on her raised hemline, she's wearing her cute little Mary Janes in the snow, I might add, in order to show us that she's keeping up with fashion and that she has the resources to not only have a car, but have her furs and pearls as well. Here we have Ella and Roy Peterson, also from the 1920s. Ella is also in a fabulously modern outfit. Her shoes make me think that this is a little bit closer to the early 20s, as these shoes were popular into the late teens as well, these sort of button-up boots. We have a pair somewhat similar to it, although not two-toned, in the exhibit just over here. Her hemline is raised, her waistline is dropped. She's also wearing a fabulous, very tightly fitted cloche hat. But also, her husband, Roy, is showing off a little bit of his modernity as well, and his wealth. He's wearing this very high starched collar. Now, collars were detachable in this time period for the most part, and they would have been heavily starched in order to keep them very upright. This was something that also required a lot of labor. If it got wet, it had to be restarched. And of course, in the Pacific Northwest, that's quite a task, right? Wealthier men also could afford to have disposable collars, which was a novelty in this time period. We often think of disposable products as something that's not really linked to wealth so much today, because they tend to be cheaper now. But disposability meant that you could buy something and throw it away. And that meant that you had resources to continue to buy. It was cheaper than just having your collar restarched. Of course, we can't know what kind of collar he's wearing, but his starched collar really does tell us something here. He's also very consciously pulling his coat back so that we can see right here his watch chain. This showing off of watches, of course, is still a symbol of wealth and prosperity. But also, when watches were less common than they are today, was also a symbol of a man who needed to know what time it was, and that meant he had important things to do. We're going to switch topics just a little bit here. Of course, clothing is really important in the way that we understand and express gender, and it always has been. I will be using largely binary terms to talk about these people and about their clothing. And that's because they largely thought of themselves in binary terms. This time period really has a very binary and very gender essentialist way of viewing gender, and by that I mean based off of anatomy. And while that is definitely true, that they thought of gender as being very binary, which many people still do today, they did express gender in their clothing within this binary in ways that we might not expect. For example, when boys were very young, they did not wear pants. Of course, we clothe our boys, our little tiny baby boys, in pants today to show that they're boys. But in the past, there was a very important part of a young boy's life, which was called breeching. This is an image of Edwin Paul Shattuck, who is the youngest son of Kate and Henry Shattuck, Kate, who we looked at earlier. He's, of course, very dapper in his fashionable little dress, and also striped stockings, which were a novelty of the time. Here we have some images of other boys who are in their skirts. You can tell more through haircuts than anything else, but also there are slight differences in the way that boys were dressed in skirts and dresses and the way that girls were dressed in skirts and dresses. Here we see this little man, Earl, wearing his plaid skirt, but you'll also notice that he's got this very soft tie. This was very common for little boys. Over here we have one of the Metzger children wearing a matching outfit with his little sister, or older sister, we don't really know. And there are pretty clear differences here. You can see he's got very sharp pleats in his skirt, and he's wearing this little jacket, whereas the girl has these more soft gathers along her skirt. And these are really common ways to show gender differences, even when children are wearing very similar clothing. Once a boy was in his breeches, this was the start of manhood. And this may be a little surprising to us because this change happened when a boy was anywhere between 2 and 10 years old. So this is pretty early for what we understand of manhood. But here we have an image of 2 little boys who don't appear to be that much different in age, yet one is still in his dresses and skirts, and one has been breeched and is in his breeches now. And look at how cute they are. Okay. Gender was also a really important part of clothing as far as women's autonomy is concerned in history. In the first wave of feminism, clothing was very symbolic in a lot of ways. In this particular picture, Maud Howitt is also wearing a watch, telling us that she also needs to know what time it is. It's possible that she had a job, or perhaps she just needed to be able to run her household efficiently. Either way, she's showing us that she is on top of things. The shirtwaist is a really important part of this early move of women into the workforce. This is an image of school children, but you'll notice that all of the little girls as well as the teachers are wearing shirtwaists. A shirtwaist is a form of a blouse. It was directly inspired by men's undershirts, and it was seen as a really practical thing to wear to work, and so it became really associated with women in the workforce. And you can see that there's a lot of variation within the shirtwaist. It could be worn in a much more feminine style with more ruffles and lace, which were things that were deeply linked to femininity by the late 19th and early 20th century. And the more masculine forms tended to have very sharp lines, a lot more very straight pleating. We have an image here of Catherine Linneman, who is this woman in the center. She's surrounded by her two daughters and a grandchild, and you'll notice that the two daughters are both wearing shirtwaists. This right here is Iona McCall. She is wearing both a shirtwaist, and if you look very closely, she's got a chain around her neck that comes down here. This is actually a watch on a necklace. This is a very feminine version of the waistcoat attached pocket watch that men would have been wearing. She actually was the first female postmaster and the first librarian at this town. Women's sports also had a really deep impact on women's clothing in the early 20th century, especially to do with clothing that was associated with the women's rights movement. This is the Gresham High School basketball champion team from 1912. I think it's quite fabulous. It's a little bit hard to see in this photograph, but all of these girls are wearing athletic bloomers. It's a lot easier to see in this image of the Gresham Hose team. Quite a few of these girls are also on that basketball team. They're wearing these bifurcated garments, which you can see even better in this picture of that same team. This picture comes from about 1913 or 1914. These girls were firefighters. In this last image, you can see that they're wearing harnesses. They're pulling the hose cart in order to put out fires. The bloomer is really deeply linked to feminist history. In the 1850s, it was introduced specifically as a form of liberating feminist clothing. However, it was so radical at the time that it really was not productive. The bloomer was seen as ridiculous and immoral, and it was pretty quickly discarded as a form of feminist clothing. Later into the 19th century, you start to see women riding bicycles a lot more. The bicycle movement was really important for women's autonomy. It allowed them to go visit their friends and travel through town more easily. It also allowed them to engage in public exercise, which was quite new at the time. And in order to do so, they needed bifurcated garments, and by this I mean split in two. And the riding habit, the bicycle habit, or also called a split skirt, was the way to do this. So you would often have the skirt that buttoned down the side and could be opened and buttoned to the other side so that you could have secret pants for when you were riding. And when you got off, you had to button that back because, of course, it was very scandalous to be wearing bifurcated garments when you were not exercising. However, into the 20th century, you start to see a lot more menswear enter women's wear, especially in work and exercise. So here we have a fabulous image of Evelyn Metzger and a friend. They're working out in their farm, or on their garden. And this is a postcard that she sent to a friend of hers and makes comment about their silly faces. I love this picture because it really shows us more the humanity of the past, right? However, even when it wasn't seen as appropriate for women to wear men's clothes, people absolutely did this. We have evidence of women wearing men's clothes essentially for as long as we have evidence of men's clothes existing. But in the American West, this was really common. In the pioneer and frontier days. People who were assigned female at birth would wear men's clothes for a variety of reasons, from safer travel to personal identification, to gaining men's work, or as a form of feminist revolt. Now, we can't project any of those reasons upon these photographs because we don't know why they took these ones. We have a small collection of images of Evelyn Metzger and her friends wearing men's clothes in the 19-teens. This is a picture of Evelyn, and she is smoking, which was a very masculine activity. And in a lot of the articles in the news about people who were caught wearing men's clothes, they often talk about how they participated in these masculine activities like smoking and gambling and drinking. I truly believe that they're just having a good old time in these photographs. You can see that their hats are a little silly and askew. The clothes don't fit them particularly well, and they're all laughing and smiling. People absolutely did play with gender in this time period, but it could be a dangerous thing to do. Some communities were more accepting of this transgression of gender than others. And that's particularly obvious when we look at the history of female husbands. Again, I'm not saying these people were in a relationship. I'm also not saying they were in a relationship. We can't know either way, really. But Evelyn Metzger, Nellie Harris, an unknown woman, and then Isabel Metzger at the end. Here they are posing as sweethearts. One of the reasons that people who were considered to be female would wear men's clothes was in order to live as men so that they could marry a woman. We have evidence of this happening all across the American West, and the reaction to this in most communities was quite negative. If people found out, it could be very dangerous. In other places, there are records of people essentially saying, well, I don't know why these newspapers are saying we didn't know. We knew the whole time. So there's varying levels of acceptance, though non-acceptance was more common. In a lot of places, it was actually illegal to dress as a gender that you were not perceived as. I hope you'll forgive me for delving slightly out of Gresham's history. This was my thesis, and so I love to talk about it. Really quickly, these two people were arrested around 1895 and 1912. Milton Matson, who is just here, arrested in 1895, had lived as a man for 25 years before his arrest, and was actually in his family home in England when he transitioned into this life. And the records that we have show that his family was very supportive of this, and in fact thought it was natural because they saw him as far more masculine than they did feminine. Harry Allen, on the other hand, was arrested many times for a variety of things. If you can read the headline here, there's a few things that they accuse him of. He was arrested in Portland in 1912. They did not actually end up charging him for the crime that they arrested him for, but they did charge him for vagrancy when they found out that his body was not what they thought it was, and they kept him in jail for 90 days. So even when there were not laws against it specifically, there were laws that were used in order to prosecute it. Again, we're going to switch topics just a little bit here. I think it's important that we understand the difference in context between photo studios and street photos, right? So let's go back to Mabel Ferris. Here we have two studio photos, one from the 1920s and one from the 1930s. I don't know if anyone's feeling brave enough, but would you mind telling me what you think we could assume from these pictures? We do have her in furs and pearls. We have her in a very fashionable silhouette from the 1930s. So is there anything we can assume about her from these images? Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point, too. Yeah, that's totally true. We can assume that she had money. We can assume that she was very fashionable. She's up to date. She changes her style between decades and as style changes. But what can't we assume? I think there's a lot we can't assume here. That's okay, let's look. These are also pictures of Mabel from around the same time period. This first one is about the 1910s, and over here we have 1920s and 30s. We have lots of pictures of her wearing more plain skirts as well on the street. But these pictures of her in pants are really exciting to me because it shows that while we know that she was wealthy, and we know that she was very fashionable, we cannot assume that she lived her life in those clothes. Those clothes were something that she put on for the camera, and it's very possible she wore them regularly, but she definitely did not wear them all of the time. And I think that's one thing that we often assume based off of the studio portraits in history is that these people looked like this all the time. Now, a lot of people in the in the 19th century didn't have a lot of outfits, so there are some times where we can say, okay, she likely didn't have a lot of other outfits. But especially as we get into the 20th century, people start to be able to afford more clothes, and the production of fashion becomes a lot faster and cheaper. Along this line of thinking, when we look at studio photography, we have to look at it through the lens of understanding these people are trying to show us something. In the case of Japanese immigrants in Gresham and in the United States in general, the wearing of Western clothing was very important. While in the 1920s, Japanese and Chinese aesthetics were absolutely being filtered in and used in Western clothing, the actual wearing of Japanese traditional clothing was seen as something that was degenerate. Women in Japanese clothing were viewed as sexually licentious because the clothing was looser than what people were used to and resembled in silhouette women's underwear. For men, the clothing was similar to what they expected women to wear, and so they viewed them as effeminate. And so the wearing of Western clothing when you immigrate to the United States is something that is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for your ability to assimilate into the culture here. And it's also important for safety. In this time period, things like the Chinese Exclusionary Act were in effect, and this had really intense effects on the communities in this area. Here we have the Sumi family. They're all in very, very clean, very up-to-date clothing. Now, it's absolutely true that they may have been comfortable in this type of clothing already, as Western clothing had started to make its way into Japan by the 1920s. But here we have images of little girls with their dropped waists. We have, again, the mother in her cloche hat. They're showing us that they are a part of this culture and a part of this community. This image, I think, is one that really struck me as I was doing this research. This is Mio Iwakoshi. She was actually the first Japanese immigrant in Oregon, period. She settled here in Gresham, in the neighborhood that's now known as Orient. She also was instrumental in making sure that people could come here, and she helped hundreds of people, Japanese people, settle in Gresham. She was a massive part of this community, and a really important part of the immigrant community here in Gresham. What we can see from this image is that, again, look at her wearing her pearls. I believe this comes from about the late 1920s into the early 30s, and I believe that because she's got these pleated knit sleeves, pleated knit skirt. This was very popular into the 30s. She's also got a little Peter Pan collar, which was very common in the late 20s and into the 30s. It's also important to look at what else is in this photograph. So she's wearing Western clothing, but she's surrounded by Japanese art. So she's showing us here, not only is she a part of the Western community and of Western culture, she is rooted in this place, but she is still showing us that where she is from. So in this photograph, we see her embracing both her cultural heritage and embracing the need to assimilate through clothing and through the way that people presented themselves in regular life. I also would like to point out that she is pictured as reading. This is most likely a Bible. We know that she was very active in the local Methodist community, and that was a part of her way to help people assimilate. Not only does this show us that she was educated and she could read, this is something that has been used in portraiture for hundreds of years, putting a book in the image to show that you are literate. But also, she's showing us that she is a part of the moral and ethical framework of Western society. So, I think that looking at these photographs is important because there is a power behind these images. Yes, we can look at them and say, well, we can't know everything about them from these pictures, which is absolutely true. But we also need to look at these and understand that there is a message that's being portrayed and that they are presenting themselves as they wished to be seen. So while we may not be able to understand who they were or exactly how they lived their lives just based off of photography and based off of the clothes that they're wearing in those pictures, we can see what they hoped to be and what they hoped to be seen as. And I think that's just as powerful. So that's the whole thing. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions. We have upcoming events, but yes, I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
When did the Japanese lady come to the U.S. of A.?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Oh, dang it, I wrote this down in another notebook. Yes. Oh, and thank you for bringing that up as well. Yes, it is on her grave marker. When she died in the 1930s, in 1931, she was actually buried in an unmarked grave. This was really important because her family had marked graves. Her husband, her first husband, was Scottish. Her second husband, or we believe her second husband, because he left her his estate, was also white, and they were buried with their names. She was buried under a single cedar tree. A Japanese cedar tree, and it took us until the 1980s to find where she had been buried. Now you can go visit her grave, but for years she was anonymous after that. And also, it's important to know that she did die in the 1930s, and so she did not live to see the community that she created dispersed. In the 1940s, of course, everyone who was Japanese in Gresham and across the U.S. were removed from their homes and taken to internment camps. And almost nobody who was removed from their communities went back to those communities. And so now we do not have a very large Japanese community here in Gresham, and that is a large part of why. So her children and her grandchildren were a part of that. Mm-hmm. that's a great question that Sylvie might be able to answer better than I would.
Yeah, absolutely. Those tour dates are, you can grab one on the way out. Fly us for in here, our cemetery tours are free, and we would love it if that's great.
Mm-hmm.
And you do see her grave, yes.
Yes.
You also see where there's more than one cemetery there, so you'll see how the communities were divided up into communities.
Yes, thank you, thank you. I rarely leave this building, so that's very helpful. Yes.
Did she have an influence in the town being named Orient?
Oh, not really, no. She, and not so far as her personally, other than she was a huge part of building this community, and the community was from the Orient, right? So,
It was named after the school district, so it was named that before she arrived.
mhm.
A lot of people for a long time thought that it was named after her.
So her name was unmarked because in the 30s, the Japanese, it wasn't the 40s yet, so it was just
Correct.
why it was unmarked.
Correct, yeah. So even in the 30s, there was pretty significant anti-Japanese sentiments growing. Anti-Asian sentiments had been pretty strong in the United States, even much earlier than that. So even when she was buried in this cemetery, she was buried with her husband, but there were people in the community that were quite upset at her being buried there at all. And so the exact reason isn't recorded, but we can assume that it was due to racism.
Is it possible that somebody took her gravestone?
No. What we do know is that when she was buried with only the solitary tree over her, which is how we were able to find her eventually. Yeah.
So you had quite a few examples of women wearing traditionally men's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find any, or have you studied any men wearing women's clothing?
This is a very exciting question. So it's definitely not my area of expertise. However, during the research that I did to talk about Harry Allen and Milton Matson, absolutely there were men wearing women's clothing. There were people who, like Harry Allen and Milton Matson, identified with being women and lived as women. There were also people who would do things like essentially dress in drag in order to have normal dances in male-dominated societies like miners' camps and things like that. There's quite a lot of reasons why people wore clothing that wasn't expected of their gender, and for men it was definitely different. It wasn't safer to wear women's clothing. For women, it was seen as being safe when you were, crossing the U.S. to come to the West. It was seen as safer to dress as a man. For men, it was definitely different. But absolutely, there's plenty of evidence. Absolutely, plenty of evidence of men wearing women's clothing for a multitude of reasons. A lot of the evidence that we have, unfortunately, comes through arrest records and through news articles, sensationalist news articles about these people. So it's not a perfect source on them, but.
Are there a lot of garments that reflect the photos that you showed us in the collection? And were they dropped off as well as with photography, or is it, how did you go?
Yeah. So our textile collection really does not have the provenance information that we wish it did. A lot of it is lacking in that sort of ownership record. We definitely have garments that are very similar to some of these, and it is a massive task to go through these images and match them to our garments, because we do have thousands of textile objects in our collection. We do have bloomers, athletic bloomers, like the ones you saw in the pictures of the Gresham basketball team and the hose team. If these were owned by them, totally possible, but we don't have the record of them owning it. Same with, we have shirtwaists, we have furs, we have lots of things that are similar and representative of this time period. But due to some of the past practices, the provenance record is a little spotty. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Do you know anything about the makers, the tailors, or what was the economy?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure there were a lot of people making their own clothes, but can you speak to that?
Yeah. So clothing was absolutely largely done by tailors and by dressmakers throughout American history and here as well. People did make their own clothing, but that happened largely in very rural locations where you didn't have access to someone who was a specialist. The idea that pioneers made their own clothing really is a distortion of some of the ideas that we have that come from the 1950s about self-reliance and women making clothing in their own homes. Now, this doesn't mean that women weren't sewing and doing all sorts of things in their own homes, but they were either doing that to, alter their clothing or to mend it or to make money. A lot of women would do sewing for other people in their own homes up until factories overtook that practice. So.
Was there any well-known shop or people or tailors who were known for their style and interests of how these trends emerged and
Right.
spread?
Right. Yeah, well, there are definitely some tailors that worked here in Gresham. Our record of them is relatively small. We have some things on maps that we are able to see, and we have some records of tailors who worked here, but the record itself is pretty spotty, unfortunately. Yes? Unfortunately, no. We really don't have that collection. It wasn't a part of our collecting policy early, which is very common in historical societies. Well, it depends. Some historical societies gathered lots and lots of indigenous pieces and belongings, but we were not one of those. So our collection really does reflect largely the white settler communities. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So what is your favorite piece that is currently in the collection? Your personal favorite?
Don't make me choose. Gosh, that's really hard. That's a really hard question because our collection is really spectacular. There's a lot of things that we have that are really beautiful, that are really emblematic of certain time periods. There's several things out on display in the exhibit that I curated that's behind us, so definitely check that out when we're done here. But I'm a really big fan of the jacket that's on display on this wall. There's a black jacket with really detailed seam bindings that are sewn by hand with silk bias binding. It's very meticulous work that really didn't need to be done. It's a beautiful piece. That's one that really stands out to me. I also am a really big fan of the split drawers that are in one of our cases over here. Split drawers were a form of underwear that had an open crotch. Very common. For women in this time period, if you've got lots and lots of skirts, you don't want to be pulling things down to go to the bathroom, especially if it's an emergency. So ease of access was really important. It also kind of puts the can-can dance into perspective. So that's another one that I really like. Oh, yeah.
I know that at certain time periods, photography studios would actually have clothing in them.
Yes, that's also true.
So I don't know which time periods, but you would have seen that in some of these, right? Where they weren't necessarily dressed in
The best, yes. No, that's absolutely true. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, absolutely. These were places where you could dress up and present yourself as something that you may not have presented yourself as in real life. So this is another reason to kind of take some of these photographs with a grain of salt. This is oftentimes aspirational, and unless you know the history of that person, it's hard to know if it's aspirational or inspirational. Yeah.
You mentioned a thesis.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you study and what was your thesis?
Yeah, so this was at Portland State University. It was largely looking at those two people that I showed you, Harry Allen and Milton Matson. I would tell you the title, but it's stupid long. It's like, yeah, it's wildly long. It was really looking at the way that these people were perceived through the photography that was published of them in crime news reporting. So looking at the different ways that clothing was perceived on in normal life and in ways that were expected, and then how it's perceived on people whose bodies aren't the ones that people expected them to be wearing. So the ways that this was seen through the concept of societal degeneration and through the closing of the frontier and all sorts of different things. Yeah, it was really interesting to research, and I went through a lot of different pathways. I first was looking at male impersonation, which was an art form, and what we might call drag kings today. Not something that probably a lot of people know about today, but it does exist and actually has existed for a few hundred years. Drag queens or female impersonators also existed in this time, but they're a little bit more represented, so which is why I chose to look at drag kings, and that got me into the people who are really wearing these things in real life, which I thought was a little bit more interesting. Yeah. All right. I think that does it. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate all your questions and all your time. Thank you.